Mareike, are you just going to let me know when you want me to change slides?
Yes, I
seeing
will
that
do
there
that.
were new ones now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's information session on entering the European market, CSR, due diligence, and ESG for ensuring compliance in your supply chain. My name is Mareike Brandt, and I'm the head of the Competence Center Sourcing here at the Southern African German Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And it is my very big pleasure to welcome you today and to open this very important session that focuses on the crucial aspects of corporate social responsibility and compliance for exporters, of course, mainly to Europe, but you will probably hear in the following that this is also relevant for many other international markets. Certainly as a topic coming up in the European Union in the future. Especially because due diligence regulations and actually acts that are mandatory for businesses to fulfill have been passed in many jurisdictions in recent years, such as the German Due Diligence in Supply Chain Act, and now even more so because last month saw the passing of the new EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that will apply from 2027 to all 27 EU member states, including, of course, Germany. Maybe just a few words about myself and the Competence Center Sourcing. And maybe, Eva, for that, you could go actually to the next slides. So you've already heard it. I mentioned it. My name is Mareike Brandt. I had the Competence Center Sourcing. I joined the chamber in the beginning of this year. I come from Germany, as you might hear. I have a very robust background in global sourcing and assisting companies with exporting to Europe or those that want to export to Europe to expand their exporting activities. And I bring much experience to the table in fostering sustainable supply chains. And we will talk a bit about what that entails in and after Eva's presentation. I have supported companies across various regions, including Southern Africa, to familiarize themselves with the German market and also the entry requirements for the German market, and of course to find German buyers. And in my role here at the Chamber, I now support companies from the region to integrate into the global supply and value chains of German, but also European companies, and to export, of course, to Europe, but also within the region. And I provide, as you can see on the slide, consultancy services on market entry, trade fairs, supply chains, and associated regulations, such as the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act, that we, I suppose, will also touch upon today. And as you can see, I also support the organization of events on these topics, such as the one that we have today. And coming with a background also from German Development Cooperation, I, of course, also advise on financing and funding opportunities. Leading maybe over to Eva at this point already. Eva, I have the survey slide in between, but maybe you can skip 2 so we can get to see your name on the slides here, or actually 3 slides, just so people can see. Yes. So let me now introduce our speaker, Ms. Eva Nolle. So Eva is the co-founder and director of operations for Ceravoid Propriety Limited, a leading commercial intelligence firm based in Cape Town here in South Africa. Eva and her company bring a wealth of expertise and experience in due diligence inquiries, background screenings, country risk assessments, market entry analysis, and commercial and fraud investigations. So Eva has quite a unique experience and perspective, being shaped by her European background and extensive experience here on the African continent. I believe Ceravoid is active in most African countries. And this, of course, makes Eva an invaluable resource for businesses looking to build a bridge between Europe and Africa. And she draws on a ton of practical experience assisting clients in gaining a better understanding of potential risks when operating on the continent and how to avoid these risks, mitigate these risks, transfer, accept, or actually also exploit them. So Eva is a certified fraud examiner, a professional certified investigator, and currently the only female in South Africa to be board certified in security management as a certified protection professional. So Eva, we are very honored to have you here and share your insights with us and your practical experience with us today. But before we go into your presentation, maybe you can skip 2 back so we can talk about the organizational remarks while people are still joining. So this session will be recorded and will be shared with you afterwards. It will last for about 90 minutes, so roughly 1 hour of presentation, and we will have about 30 minutes for Q&A session here. The presentation will also be shared after the session. So if you have any questions, please could you put them into the chat, and myself and my colleagues, we will monitor the chat and we will post these questions to Eva after her presentation. And if you have any technical issues, please also reach out to us through the chat and we'll try to assist you as best we can. And Eva, maybe going on 1 slide while we wait. I see we are at 54 participants at the moment. While we are wait for a few other participants to join us, I would actually like to quickly invite you to go to the link that we shared here through the QR code and send us your experience with any of the new German and European due diligence and supply chain regulations. So you'll see here just a very, very short survey, 5 points. Maybe you could let us know which sector you're coming from when you're joining today. What is your awareness, especially of the 3 laws that we've mentioned here? So the LKSG, the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, then CBAM, that's the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. We have the European Directive on deforestation here. And what your experience basically is with compliance with these regulations, the impact of these regulations, and if you need any further support. If you could let us know, maybe take 2-3 minutes to fill this in, we would be very grateful. And then in a couple of minutes, we can kick this session off. So I suppose we'll give this 1 more minute or 2. I see there's still some people joining. You can, of course, also still finish that survey after Eva's presentation. I see we have 61 people joining now, so I think, Eva, we're going to kick this session off. So I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to you. and you will now guide us through the intricacies of CSR due diligence and ESG compliance in supply chains. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mareike. Well, I will try my best to guide you through it. It's obviously a, bit of a convoluted topic, so lots of ground to cover. I just want to start to get a bit of all us all on the same page here with regards to some of the terminology that obviously plays a role in also the legislation that Mareike mentioned that has been enacted or is coming up. And all of it is based on corporate social responsibility, which is basically the impact that a company has on the society in which it operates. Until now, corporate social responsibility was, considered a nice to have. It's ethical to operate within, CSR spaces, and a philanthropic approach from a company rather than a must-have or a compliance issue. But also all these terms like CSR, it is a bit, I want to call it wishy-washy maybe. A lot of people, struggle to really get a firm grip, right? So according to the ISO standard, the definition is that the objective of social responsibility is to contribute to sustainable development on the society, and it operates, and obviously that can also then differ depending on the society that a company is operating on. The ISO standard already, though, obviously voluntary to adopt an ISO standard, goes a step further to say that an organization should consider the environmental, social, and governance aspect, right? Not only with organizations that it has, but also that it seeks to have a relationship with. So the ISO standard was kind of like one of the first ones that brought in supply chains into CSR requirements and started that conversation of it's not only about the impact that your own company has, but also what kind of impact the companies in your supply chains have. But seeing that we said, CSR is just, was for the longest time a nice to have rather than a must. Obviously, the question became, or is often for companies, why should we care, right? Obviously, not all companies. A lot of companies really do it voluntarily out of the good of their heart. But there is a real benefit to companies when following the guidelines of CSR, because it does directly impact its reputation. I think that's the most evident one for people to see, but it also obviously now impacts things like impacting the employees' morale, in how investors view it, the relationship with companies in your supply chain or as business partners. But also then to retain actually the customers, the clients, your staff, because it is becoming more and more an important topic for most people. The difficulty comes in that it's not only the reality of what you do when it comes to your CSR programs, it's also the perception. So you might be doing everything right, but if your company is not perceived to do everything right, then it's as if you're not doing it. So there is a big discrepancy between, the perception versus reality. And the worst a company can probably do is say one thing, but do another thing. And that impact is only increasing, the impact of CSR and ESG onto how a company is viewed, and in turn, the success of its operations. So why is that, right? In the past, I want to say if we go back 20 years or so, the biggest problem a company might have to face when, not operating so ethically in terms of CSR and environmental impact was probably something like we're seeing here on the picture, where very militant groups would take on big companies and try to raise awareness, and impact companies' operation to change their ways. But as we said a couple of minutes ago, corporate social responsibility is all about the impact and perception of the society a company operates in. And that is subject to change. Our society changed over the years, how people view things changed over the years. And now we're seeing that it's no longer just a few militant groups, but you have websites like you see here that rate company on their CSR, on their ESG programs, and boycott on a major scale. This is just one sample of a website. There's a lot more. We've all seen Fridays for Future a couple of years ago that had a massive impact globally, and really rattled some companies. So there is a shift in society, how CSR topics are viewed. And with that, companies need to take it more seriously than, what they might have done a couple of years ago, because it is going to have a major impact on your operations. So the definition of CSR included environmental, social, and governance aspects. So the question then is obviously, what is the difference between CSR and ESG? So while CSR is usually viewed more as an internal factor and the commitment of a company to operate sustainable, respect the environment, ESG is now becoming a more external factor. It's about integrating those CSR commitments into more structured programs and also supporting this with data. It's no longer just a pledge or a policy. It's actually proving to the outside world, this is what we're doing. Here's the data to back it up. And that is becoming a valuable tool for companies because investments are becoming highly dependent on ESG programs within companies, and companies no longer have a real choice whether they want to follow ESG guidelines, but they have to prove it. This is the 2022 report, just to kind of, put some figures behind it, seeing that we just talked about, supporting data, which basically, as you can see, there is numbers where big investment firms, such as the Harvard's endowment, which is the biggest endowment fund in the world, stated that they will divesting itself from any fossil fuel companies, right? And other endowments have followed. Goldman Sachs pledged that they will get out of companies that do not have a diverse board, which falls under the governance aspect of ESG. ESG-driven investments are expected to grow exponentially in the next couple of years and exceed $53 trillion by next year. So that is huge numbers, and all that ties into ESG. The problem comes in that most companies do not quite feel prepared for what is coming their way. This is a report that was published earlier this year, which was based on a survey of predominantly European and US companies in terms of how well they are prepared for ESG legislation coming their way, or also what is the current status of their ESG programs. As you can see, the majority of companies don't feel prepared. They're expecting that their budgets will have to grow quite a bit, especially when it comes to the social part of ESG, which we're going to concentrate on a little bit later, because that is usually the part which is a lot more difficult for companies. And 77% of companies stated in the survey that they are not yet including responsible supply chains in their programs. And that will become the issue when the legislation kicks in, especially the European one. Obviously, the German one has already started last year. So as we're seeing that progressing, more and more companies will fall under the legislation, or in turn, once they start falling under their respective legislation, will start enforcing it on their respective supply and value chains. And that's where then it has that trickle effect of companies that might not be based in Europe yet or in the US. The US is also working on the legislation, but today we'll concentrate on Europe predominantly. So even if you're not operating there yet, or you're not based there, you might find that, as the month and years pass now, you will become subject to due diligence inquiries or be asked to do a little bit more, because the companies that you want to do business with, that you are already doing business with, they're now going to fall under those legislations and have to look at their supply and value chains. So just so that, it becomes a little bit more tangible what we're looking at when it comes to these words of ESG, right? ES is obviously for environmental. That is usually the part, funny enough, that companies feel often most comfortable with. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of the topics under E are a little bit more tangible for companies. Some of those things are measurable, and can also be independently verified, right? So you can measure the gas emissions of a company. You can look at and, quantify how waste is discarded. So a lot of times companies feel that at least that is the part that they've got the most handle on when it comes to the three pillars. The governance part is obviously, how the company puts their board together, their staff components. What is the anti-corruption guidelines a company follows, financial policies. I don't have to tell you, governance is usually also something that, has become quite popular in the last couple of years, but it does fall into it. And again, it's, probably something you can look at, from an outside perspective and see what the board composition is, right? How many females, how many, other categories are represented there. So again, one of those where companies still feel slightly more comfortable when it comes to checking their own compliance on those matters. As we saw in the survey, the S seems to be the part where people struggle quite a bit. And I think that is because oftentimes it can be a little bit less tangible for people to grasp. And also, though, it is a highly emotionally charged topic compared to some of the others, especially when it comes to something like modern slavery and human rights. So that is one point that I would like to drill in a bit more, because a lot of times companies are not able to wrap their head around quite as much why that is important as a company and why you have to be cognizant of it. But because it's such an emotional topic, the blowback potential there is also the highest, together with environmental transgressions, obviously, where if companies do not get it right, it has a major impact on your reputation and in turn your company operations. So it is something to really take seriously. So human rights is by nature not granted by a state or anybody. They are inherent to any human being. You have them just because you're born. They cannot be taken away, and the one cannot be enjoyed without the other. However, human rights are the state has a vertical obligation to ensure that their population and the people in their country enjoy those human rights. They're not the responsibility of any companies, because companies cannot be party to international treaties. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an international treaty. Hence, technically, companies cannot, be held accountable in the first sense of the word. But if you look at the list of human rights according to the UN Declaration, this is the 30 human rights that we all have. And in some countries, the state might not be as strong to actually guarantee those rights to their population. So companies in those vacuums tend to have a stronger position than the actual state to guarantee at least some of them, if not all, right? So if you look at the blue ones, it's pretty obvious, right? It's pretty obvious why a company or a business might have an impact on that specific right, such as rest and holiday. If I don't give my staff leave, then, I technically, and all weekends, I technically take that away, right? The red ones are equally impactable by any business, though. And so we're already moving to like very serious infringements on human rights on any of those, but especially those. And so companies need to acknowledge the fact that they have an impact on those human rights, and they can severely hurt human rights, especially more so in countries where the state is actually too weak to guarantee them, because at that point, the companies are probably the ones, that can make it either worse or better. And that's really also now where we're seeing this shift in terms of it's no longer an ethical problem. It's a compliance issue, because around the world, we saw this shift of countries and companies realizing that we cannot solely rely on states anymore to grant human rights, to enforce environmental infringements. So the legislation we're seeing now coming up is basically based on that, to say, we need to hold companies accountable. We need to make sure that companies have a system in place to actually identify where they have an impact on these areas and how they can mitigate the impact if the impact is adverse. Mareike mentioned the German law earlier. It's the Lieferkettengesetz that was, came into effect on the 1st of January in 2023 in a tiered approach. So the first companies that had to comply with had about 3,000, had to have 3,000 staff and up. As of January 2024, the threshold got lowered to 1,000. And the French law that we're seeing here has had a similar approach. It got started a bit earlier, but it's all a tiered approach. And so will the European legislation have a tiered approach when it does come into effect. As Mareike mentioned, it was finally decided on and signed off in April this year, and is expected to come into force in 2027. And then I believe they're starting with 5,000 plus staff, and there is a turnover threshold as well. However, the turnover threshold also will apply to companies that generate that amount of turnover within Europe, even if their base is outside of Europe. So already there we're seeing that it's not just, I'm not based in Europe, I don't, fall under that. Mind you, the thresholds are quite high, but it will come, even if you're not based there, or if you're dealing with a company and you are in their supply chain and you don't even know, obviously, until now, how much turnover they're actually generating in the EU, and they might all of a sudden from 2027 fall under that law, and then in turn, put certain obligations onto you in their value chain and enforce it because they have to. There's a very big difference, or like one of the decisive differences between the upcoming EU legislation and the German legislation, for those who have already, started looking into it, is that the EU legislation is foreseeing to include civil liability, which means companies that have had a detrimental effect on the societies in which they operate can be held liable civilly by those victims, right? And again, the CSR and everything until now also there was a lot of points where the companies were more looking internally, how all those things affect me as a business, whereas now with the legislation, we very critically have to look at what impact are we having on the communities that we are operating in, and how can we minimize that. And the civil liability is going to be a major change for especially German companies, obviously, that have now, been working towards compliance with the German law. And then in a couple of years, once the European law is coming into effect, they will have to potentially look at that or just face the consequences. The good news about this legislation, though, is that the expectation is not that you have to show that you do not have an impact at all, right? Nobody's expecting at this moment in time that, there is nothing happening, no detrimental impacts on either the E, the S, or the G in your supply chain. The expectation that is stipulated in those legislations is that you make an effort and that you have measures in place to identify, address, and mitigate risk factors. And if you identify an impact, mitigate, or best case scenario, abolish the impact that you're having, right? So that's really where that sits, and that's why there is that name in the legislation already, which alludes to it, which is the due diligence, right? So the directive states that it establishes a corporate due diligence duty, which means that companies have to identify, bring to an end, or prevent, and then account for the negative human rights and environmental impacts of their own operations, and like we said before, their value chain and their subsidiaries. So that is what the guideline or the directive states. It doesn't say we all expecting that there's nothing that we'll find. Everybody is aware that there's probably a lot we'll find. The key is going to be to be able also to show we're trying everything to identify where those risk areas are. And then once we have done so, we can actually, do something to mitigate it. The big issue is going to come in, and how we have seen that in the past, even outside of actual legislation already being enforced, that there is not just the subsidiaries, which is an ownership control of companies. So, right, I have a subsidiary somewhere, I have the actual control over what's happening there. So it's easy for me to enforce the compliance with legislation or put a risk approach in place to identify certain negative impacts. But it also now deals with the factual control. So that's where the value chains come in. Where do you have contracts? Where is a company in a position where they should have, could have known, or whether there is leverage in indirect business relationships. So companies really have to take a critical look at their entire value chain and see where could we be considered having factual control over the operations of another business that is part of our value chain, and what can we do to identify those negative impacts there, and what can we do to then mitigate it if we find some. We're going to look at a bit of a case study at the end where that really came into play and the company had to settle because they were taken to task for should have had exercised their duty of care in Kenya from the UK because of the contractual cascading effect that they had. So all these legislations are now talking about you have to do due diligence, and due diligence, unfortunately, is one of those terms in the world that does not have a proper definition or that comes with a checklist. A due diligence by nature is the prudence that can be expected of a reasonable person under the circumstances and is always dependent on the particular case. So we as a company, we do due diligence. A due diligence for a merger and acquisition, in preparation of a merger and acquisition, to be exact, looks very different from an anti-corruption due diligence. So that's the unfortunate part about the wording of these legislations. It's very up to the individual case. However, we're going to go into it in a little bit. There is some guidelines that you can use, but I just want to take a moment to really look at what due diligence is and why is it beneficial for companies in the first place, and then obviously even more so now with ESG legislation coming in. So usually a due diligence is conducted when a company is expected to change its position based on what's called apparent conditions or representations made by other parties. So apparent conditions would be a due diligence based on going into a new country and making sure that you cross your T's and dot your I's before you go into a country there, but also what's happening usually when it's about mergers and acquisitions is have a third party independently verify what the company that you are merging with or acquiring is representing. Because oftentimes, even if it's not maliciously, people try to put their best foot forward when they're about to be acquired. And the information that you are provided cannot just be taken at face value, but you want to independently verify it before you make a business decision. And basically, just due diligence is about doing your homework. Don't just trust the information that you are provided. You want to make sure that you're dealing with the upper Buckingham Palace rather than the lower Buckingham Palace on these pictures, right? And that's really what a due diligence is. You're looking at not what happened in a specific crime, for example, but if we're looking at corruption, you're not looking at who paid who specifically in one specific corruption case. You're looking at what kind of risk factors are there that could potentially, make my risk higher that corruption will occur, right? So it's what's called an informational investigation or an exploratory investigation. We're not looking at specific crimes. We're looking at everything around it to see what conditions are there to actually make that happen. And that's where that intersection is to classical security risk management, whose job it is to protect your company asset, right? It's not just beneficial to do a due diligence, it's imperative to do a due diligence to really protect those company assets. If you look at all the things that can impact it and that you want to kind of protect you from, right? So if you look at the ESG due diligence that we just talked about, again, it's not specifically always going to look at a specific human rights abuse. It's going to look at what kind of conditions are present where we're operating that might facilitate the existence of human rights abuses or might make it easier for those breaches to occur in environmental discretions. And then obviously further down the line, you might come to identify certain specific incidents. But the big thing about ESG due diligence is going to be exploring the factors around it and seeing where is your risk specifically high for those transgressions to occur, right? So if I talk about security risk management is protecting company assets, then as security professionals, we usually tend to look at those 4 assets that we need to and want to protect for a business. And again, if you circle it back to ESG due diligence, you will very quickly see that conducting ESG due diligence is going to protect those 4 assets by the people, obviously the social aspect, but also the governance aspect. The reputation is a huge one for ESG due diligence just because of the impact it can have when a transgression becomes apparent and you have not done anything about it, especially in this day and age. We're living in a world where everything is global, where information travels as fast as lightning. And a transgression in Niger is probably not going to just stay a transgression in Eisner for locally, but it will very quickly, obviously depending on the scale, but very quickly can go global and can have a major impact on your reputation, and then by default also your property, which is your financial standing, your turnover, but also your actual physical assets. The last thing you want is not being compliant with legislation or adhering to certain CSR guidelines and your property being attacked because the community that you're operating in feels that you're not actually taking care and respecting them. So ESG due diligence or due diligence, in its entirety in various forms for other reasons is not just if I have budget left over, it would be beneficial. It actually can make a major impact on your bottom line and have a huge return on investment because it will have a positive effect on those things. And obviously, with the numbers that we saw also that a lot of companies will now make decisions on investments based on ESG programs that are in place. Like that's a very tangible impact on your property and financial stations right there, because you will probably struggle a lot more in the years to come to get investments if you can't show that you actually have certain things in place. I know all of this sounds a bit like a monumental task in terms of, implementing this and getting to a point where you can show compliance and those aspects. Just remember that one of the big things is in the legislation even to say you need to show an effort. You need to show that you have measures in place. A lot of companies, obviously, depending on their size, already have some programs in place. Something like an anti-corruption framework lends itself very nicely to be adjusted and also be used for ESG purposes. The reason for that is that things like human rights, thrive in an environment where corruption is, very present. But even environmental transgressions will probably have a higher risk in occurring in countries where you see a high corruption rate. And that is because where there's high corruption, it usually undermines the functioning and legitimacy of institutions that should make sure that those transgressions do not occur. So if you are a business that already has an anti-corruption framework, use that as your backbone and twist it and incorporate some of your ESG issues. A lot of companies have due diligence questionnaires that they give out when they enter new partnerships or potential new partnerships. Look at ways to incorporate ESG components into that so that you can already, have just a few measures in place, even if you're not yet quite there to go full on and all out. The major thing is that you can and should and take a risk-based approach, right? That means your risk is going to be higher in certain industries or jurisdictions than in others. If your company has operations or touch points in your value chain with mining operations in the Congo, those are probably more prone to potential transgression and are at a higher risk than if you're dealing with an accountant firm in New York City, right? Just by the very nature of their industry and their jurisdictions. So companies are gonna start looking at, designing heat maps, for lack of a better word, and really identifying those are our major issues, probably country-wise, and then within that also obviously the industries, and they will start there, and the expectations and the checks are going to be a lot more stringent in the high-risk countries and industries, and then obviously cascading down. So have a critical look at what industry are you operating in, what jurisdictions are you operating in, and also though, is there other industries in your value chain that might have a higher risk than yourself? So start there and then work your way down, just to not make it too overwhelming. So the risk factors you want to look at is, where's a country that I'm operating in where there is political instability, because that comes, like I said, with the institutional weaknesses, and there is bound to be more issues than others. If you have a collapse of civil infrastructure, you have widespread violence coming your way. Again, corruption is fostering all those. So those are kind of the risk factors that you want to look for, and then truncate down from there. There is great resources out there also. There is companies that publish maps of the world in certain risk ratings of countries. So it's nicely color coded. It's very visual to see where the countries, where those risk factors are really high, and then look at whether you have operations there or not, and use that kind of as your baseline. Because the one big issue you're gonna have is that due diligence usually deals with what's called secondary sources and then primary sources, right? So the secondary sources are your public databases, your CIPC checks that you can do in South Africa, is a company involved in litigation, or even just media, whereas the primary sources are usually talking to people, first-hand knowledge of certain things. And in countries where you have those institutional weaknesses and other risk factors that are very high, not only is your risk really high, it also, the circumstances there will impede your ability to access the information you need to conduct a proper due diligence according to what the legislation wants you to do. Because in those countries, you often find that the press freedom is not, quite there. You don't have access to good databases, or the databases are not as comprehensive. So you will very much rely on, or have to rely on, those primary sources, that first-hand knowledge. We had cases where everything seemed to be above board based on, the public records and all the secondary sources. But then when you speak to people that are operating opposite the company, they will tell you that there's children going in the morning, they're coming out at night, and they will actually, work there all day. You will not find that in secondary sources. So especially when it comes to things like human rights abuses and the social aspects, or even corruption payments, it's a lot more difficult to pick those things up in the secondary sources. So you will have to concentrate in your high risk areas. You will have to concentrate on first-hand knowledge and get your hands dirty a bit to really get the information that you want. There is some guidelines or some paperwork that you can use when it comes to, building your frameworks, if that's where you already are. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have been around since 2011, and they kind of looked at as a bit of the foundation for a lot of the ESG legislation that is coming up now. And the nice thing about those guiding principles is that there is a lot of implementation help that comes with it, and that kind of guides you through what you should be looking at. And they also have a bit of a step-by-step, this is what a due diligence should look like, which is basically, assess the actual and potential impacts in your value chain, act upon those findings, then track the responses and track whether whatever your actions were actually had an impact, and then communicate how you actually address those impacts. So those are the 4 kind of steps in a due diligence that the UN Guiding Principles recommend. The other documents that I mentioned here also have some great insights. So there is already documentation that you can use to kind of help you implement your programs, because it is going to be costly. There's no 2 ways around that. It's not only gonna, have a direct impact if you do not comply with ESG legislation, because now you're more prone and fragile to fraud and corruption and asset misappropriation. It will have, with the legislation coming, huge financial implications. There is talks about, I believe about like 5%, punitive costs for certain transgressions. And obviously now also with the European legislation implementing civil liability, that means then the victims can go after you, and it's no longer going to be in the country where the transgression occurred. It's going to be in the European jurisdiction, because it has to do with the legislation that is coming up there. And then also a lot of companies might be then falling under subsequent loss of income because of the society watching and actually also judging the transgression. So there is, depending on obviously what actually happened, there can be major loss of income subsequent to it, because civil society is actually going to watch what you're doing or boycotting your business. So those are the kind of, pointers that you want to look at, especially if, your business, head of business thinks it's too expensive to implement a due diligence framework already now before you have to comply with legislation, because those things is all things we're already seeing. And we're all about numbers and companies, so we need to kind of calculate return on investments and a good cost-effective strategy. So use those numbers from cases that already occurred to really make your business case, if you need to make one for whoever. So the 2 cases that really kind of, made headlines around the world and really nicely show why it's already important, even if you're not falling under legislation quite yet, is the one that occurred in the UK/Malawi and Kenya, was in late 2020. where 85 plaintiffs took a UK holding company to task for the crimes that were committed by security guards on their avocado plantations in Malawi and Kenya. Now, while the UK company, first obviously said they didn't have anything to do with it, it circles back to the factual control that we talked about earlier, because at the end, what was discussed was they would have had an immense impact on the duty of care, on what happened on their avocado plants in both Kenya and Malawi. And they eventually decided to settle for 10 million US dollars and across both jurisdictions, but also including things like the legal fees. They committed to a human rights impact assessment that they were going to do. They committed to investing in community projects in the areas where they were operating. However, like that's 10 million plus just in money being paid out. When I wrote an article about this a few years back, I actually spoke to some NGOs in the UK and the Netherlands that were following this case. And they vowed to make sure that these avocados from these farms were not going to be sold in UK supermarkets until the holding company in the UK could prove that they were actually following through with their commitments, like the human rights impact assessment or the investment into community projects. And they were putting pressure on UK supermarkets to not put those avocados on the shelf. So again, there is a domino effect that occurs because society is watching and society is putting pressure on you. And this company had a huge loss of income because they weren't able to find a UK supermarket that was willing to put their avocados on the shelf because the NGOs were watching and were causing major stress for the UK supermarkets. All of that, though, wouldn't have been able, again, to find in public databases, right? The UK company would have not been able to know through database entries and records at courts or any other regulatory authority that those things were happening. Those things is things that you have to put in place through those primary sources and kind of keeping your ear on the ground. This also doesn't, get discovered by self-reporting, because no security company or any other company for that matter is gonna, self-report necessarily that like that is what's happening, depending on the scale, obviously. So major financial damage there for the UK company. And the other one that's still ongoing and people might have heard about is happening in the US, where a US human rights lawyer sued Apple, Dell, Alphabet, which is the holding company of Google and Tesla, in December 2019 for aiding and abetting the death and serious injuries of children that occurred on cobalt mines in the DRC. Cobalt is used in lithium batteries, which is obviously those companies are using a lot of. And basically, one of the criminal charges that was laid was the charge of fraud, because the human rights lawyers argued that all these companies had in their company policies and on their company websites that they were not using child labor, but yet in their value chain, child labor occurred. And they should have or could have known that because Amnesty International repeatedly published reports on how cobalt mines, especially in the DRC, are using child labor. So the argument there was they should have known, they could have known if they had only done their homework. And on top of all of that, they probably did know and lied about it in their company policies. So this is still going through the courts. It's obviously dragging on quite a bit. The last ruling was in March of this year, so they cannot, go after injunctive relief, but they can pursue damages. That is the standing at the moment. The lawyers are expecting a payout of about $1 million US per every life lost per case where the child was maimed, and they are looking at 16 applicants here. So even if we play it conservatively, if that was the number you wanted to go on in the hopes that the lawyers are kind of right in their estimations, then you would be looking at $16 million that they're kind of looking for at the moment. So it is a lot of money that, can occur. And with the upcoming ESG legislation, it's only going to get worse because now, lawyers that want to come after you do not have to scratch for any laws that they can use. It's already there then in place, which what legislation they can use to come after you. So keep an eye on it, on the developments, or whether or not you might fall under it, depending on your touch points. But it might already be kind of a best approach to implement some of the things you can at a very comparatively low threshold to be able to be in a good position to comply should you fall under it in a year or two when those things are actually going to kick in from a European perspective. So with that, I'm pretty much on my allotted time, and I'm going to go and hand it back over to Nikita and Mareike for questions. Mareike, I think you're on mute still.
That is correct. Yes, I pressed the button already, but as it were, it did not work. I was just thanking you, dear Eva, for sharing your insights on this topic of CSR, due diligence, and ESG today. We are now ready to take questions. I have not seen any in the chat yet. I have also posted our contact details, Eva's and mine, in the chat. So you could also, of course, always ask them afterwards, but do use the opportunity to ask them now. For that, if you have any questions spontaneously, you could also raise your hand and then I can unmute you. And if you want, you can also switch on your camera. I don't see any raised hands as of yet. I do see one. Let me quickly unmute you and go to your question. Okay. Tokosizi Mewia, you can go ahead and ask your question to Eva. I think you are also still on mute. You should be able to.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yes,
Thank you.
good morning.
Great. Thank you so much to the both of you for arranging this session, specifically for going through the case examples. It serves very well for contextualizing. So, I mean, with reference to the case examples, it appears as though sort of the precedents at case level are still being established, even though much of the legislation is in place and the structures, et cetera, is would one be rational in thinking along the lines of that the precedence has a far greater consequence than what the legislation may currently be? I'm just looking at the cases that we looked at, and it looks
Right.
as,
Yeah.
it looks as though, yeah, it looks as though kind of guys, because of guys being made an example of, there's sort of like an incremental intensity in terms of what being responsible looks like. And so we're going to find ourselves in a place where, fair enough, there's the prescribed sort of legal framework, but then, you know, the precedence is going to say, well, actually, it's much worse than that. I'll listen for it. Thank you.
Good question. I think there's like two. That's a two-pronged answer, right? The one is absolutely right. You know, the case studies obviously, you know, can have a big impact again, because, like, you know, CSR, ESG all boils down to what is the expectation of a society. So, you know, because the society has such a great interest in it, it has a huge impact if you one of the companies that is being made an example of, and then obviously subsequently, you know, a lot of companies will look for that, and the society, I think, kind of pushed ahead a bit in front of the legislation. So the legislation wasn't there yet, so, you know, the society decided we're no longer going to wait and just tolerate, we're actually going to use loopholes to, you know, find other ways to get after it. But also the legislation is obviously coming, and especially then in countries like the US, for example, that, you know, uses case law. So precedence is going to play a major role there. And that's why it's also taking so long there, because whatever the outcome of that court case is going to have a major impact going forward. So 100% right. You know, the case studies kind of really scare a lot of big companies, but the legislation is going to come into play. It's just taking a bit longer, because it's legislation and it's taking its own sweet time until it really can be fully implemented and enforced.
Thank you for that, Eva. I see Mark Taylor having his hand up.
Hi, yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Eva, thanks very much for that briefing. And it, as I said in the chat, it confirmed things that I've seen. The organization that I work for, we're a business incubator and accelerator, working closely with the mining houses and public sector entities, departments of economic development and so on in South Africa, relating to manufacturing and engineering in mining and so on. So we're in the trenches, working with the communities, and not just, it's not, oftentimes people see corporate social responsibility as painting a school 10 times in a year and handing over computers, and then you've done your, you've done your bit for your CSR and that. We're approaching it differently, and I was just curious, which sectors are more mature in their thinking on a more sophisticated and strategic approach to the social side, where you're actually actively working with your communities impacted by mining, for example, but in other industries as well, that they're actually doing it in a more mature approach, and not just like painting a school, but looking at how can they strategically work with local companies and so on, and come up with some really innovative approaches to challenges that they might be facing. An example in the mining sector, for example, is using 4IR technologies like drones or Internet of Things and that, but using your local community companies to be the main driver of 4IR or innovative changes or developing solutions for problems that you might be encountering, like your wastewater treatment and that sort of stuff, instead of always defaulting to well-established companies based in Gauteng, as an example, when you're doing operations in Katu. Which sort of industries are more mature in their thinking and being strategic around real social development, but from an innovative 4IR kind of an aspect. I don't know if my question makes sense, but I'm just curious as to what you're picking up on.
It does. It's difficult to say because obviously, I don't quite have insights into like, a lot of the like details of every, industries, like how does it look in the end of the day. But I would say the industry that is really like in the forefront of doing, having something in place is the extractive industries. And obviously mining and oil and gas and those kind of industries, because there already for a number of years you have what's called the voluntary principles of security and human rights, which is a lot of governments and big extractive firms committing to respecting human rights and implementing programs and working together with the communities that they operate in, because by their very nature, those industries tend to operate in more rural settings. So they're very reliant also on being in the grace and favor of the communities that they operate in. So I want to say the extractive industry is probably the forefront because they had something streamlined for the longest.
Okay, thanks. And then second question, if you don't mind, which countries are you finding, or regions, or or cities, or however you want to look at it, are the most progressive in this, in embracing it and understanding it and legislating it, but really practically speaking, what is your experience in that regard? Thank you.
I don't think you can drill it down to cities. Obviously, we've seen it with France first. Like they were one of the first countries to implement it, like from a legislation point of view. And then obviously, Europe comes as a whole now because the US is still fighting over how they're implementing it and in what sense, and it's not quite there yet. We're not seeing a lot of movement on those kind of things in the Asian countries. So, at the forefront at the moment, it's Europe and the US and what you would probably classically term the West that is kind of there.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. That's very useful. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, then next we have Melissa from EcoCert. I see you have your camera on already. Yes.
Thank you very much for taking my question. So we would just like to know, so for those that aren't aware, EcoCert is a certification body dealing both on the environmental, social, and ethical sides. If there is any third-party certifications that have already been earmarked going forward that companies would be able to get in place to tick off certain things that they would need for their ESG and their due diligence.
That's great to know.
Or do you need me to repeat the question?
Sorry, I didn't understand that there was I didn't quite hear the question in it. So if you could, the question part I need repeating on then.
No problem. So we're looking into the companies to get in place their due diligence and the various ESG factors.
Right.
Is there third-party certification that they could get in place already to adhere to the different parts that they must have?
I think the only like independent certification that I'm aware of is the ISO standard that is probably lending itself to it. I'm not aware of any other independent certifications that are out there in the market that a company can pursue. There is those frameworks that I mentioned that can be used to show we are, in compliance with XYZ. The other one would be the, voluntary principles on human rights, but that is only for the extractive industry. So their companies can become a signatory. It's not really a certification as such, but you can become a signatory to it. But the ISO one would probably be the big one for now.
Okay. So, for example, when it comes to things like Fair for Life certification, which is fair trade certification, which looks a lot at the social compliances as well, would that be something then along the supply chain that would carry weight? Or is that something that would be looked into in the future to see if that can be used as a verification tool within Germany and other European countries?
As far as I'm aware, there's none of those certifications yet where it says, okay, that's the gold standard. If you're certified there, then it's all good. That probably has a lot to do with those certifications are obviously like not enforceable as such. Like a company does a certification and then you have it, and so I think the legislator might not want to affiliate themselves with any program. However, having said that, obviously, if there is a certification like that in place and there is one can really show this is the, steps we had to take to get that certification, and we have to, I don't know, prove every year that we're still doing it, or
Yes.
whatever the case might be, it probably will have some weight towards the company that is asking you for those kind of things, because as part of their due diligence, because then you can show that it was independently verified. So I don't think it's going to come from a legislation point of view, but it's probably going to count in your favor and make your life a lot easier when dealing with companies that have to fall under the legislation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Does that help?
It does. I think this is something that will probably be taken up in legislation and with one-on-one companies to see what would they like to put in place and how can we, from that's more on the ground dealing with the producers towards the markets, what we can put in place along the whole supply chain. But I think it's definitely a good start to start there.
100%.
Thank you very much.
I'm also going to come in on that. You may have seen me nodding my head while Eva was talking. I have looked at that in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chain Act. And there has actually been an overview been published, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, over certificates and initiatives, as it were, so membership initiatives for the German market that can help showcase that companies comply with certain due diligence regulations. So as Eva has said, there are no panacea for showing you are fulfilling all of the requirements, but for certain requirements, especially the social aspects that Eva has mentioned, and also some environmental standards, sometimes also governance criteria, those can contribute to showing compliance, and hence they are playing a part in the reporting then for example, the German company that ultimately has to show to the German authorities that they are complying with the requirements of the German law. As I take the next question, I'm quickly going to search for the link and I will drop it in the chat for you. And with that being said, let me go to the next person. I see Jai-Sheila Rajput. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly. Please pose your question.
Sure, it's close enough. It's Jai-Sheila Rajput. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation, especially to be able to look at it with your focus from a due diligence perspective. If I may, I'm going to quickly respond to Melissa's question. So I know that there is not a lot that's in place in terms of certification per se, but there are quite a number of things in place in terms of ESG scores, especially from a ranking and rating perspective. And Melissa, I would really urge you to have a look at that. Quite a number of our clients are specifically looking at these criteria from a holistic perspective, and that's where it has a knock-on effect, especially in terms of the legislature when it comes to due diligence. I also wanted to give an additional comment to say that when you're looking at sustainability and sustainability reporting holistically, there's a need to be able to develop a materiality matrix. And what we've done for our clients is that we've actually developed a tool where we layer together the materiality matrix together with the risk factors. And that way you have a much more holistic cube to be able to actually support organizations to be able to understand what the needs are from your perspective, but also from your external stakeholders' perspective, building in those risk factors. But that isn't really my question. That was just my quick feedback to that side. My question is more with regard to CBAM. What we found is that it's a great initiative from a European perspective and being able to actually look at things from a on-the-ground carbon footprint perspective. But we find that, especially for external players coming into the European market, it is something that is being perceived or indicated as a disadvantage. So there's an anticipation that it may result in a reduction of African exports into the EU. And I was curious to see, Eva, what are your thoughts and your comments as far as that goes? Because from our side, we're trying to encourage our clients to enter these markets, but they really see this as another obstacle or barrier coming their way. Just as a quick one, I'm from TOMA now, Tomorrow Matters Now. We are a green economy consultancy, and we're supporting organizations being able to enter these types of markets, whether it is being more responsible in Africa or whether it is in terms of export markets in turn, just so that you have a little bit of context. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I think Mareike is a lot more well-versed in CBAM specifically than I am, so I'm sure she can have a comment on that one more specifically. But in the greater scheme of things, I think it's always an issue when it comes to, legislation that now is like, not necessarily coming from your home country, right? So all of a sudden you have to comply with legislation that like you didn't have any say in, right? We see that a lot also with anti-corruption compliance issues and stuff like that. So, it is an issue, and obviously can cause some problems. But like I say, Mareike is, I think, a lot more well-versed in that specific law than I am. So I'm going to put that one over to you, Mareike.
Yeah, well, a lot more, but not a great lot, I should also say, in the sense of, I mean, it is fairly new legislation, and also in Germany. And Eva, you also touched upon that in your presentation when you gave us the figures, how actually companies that are affected in the Western countries deal with it by saying, oh, well, we are not quite sure what we're doing. So this is also, according to my understanding, where CBAM is at the moment. So CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is basically a mechanism to include CO2 emissions for energy-intensive products such as fertilizer, aluminium, steel. For those of you who haven't heard about it yet, and basically those companies inside of the EU, they already have to do it, but also outside of the EU have to measure their CO2 emissions and then report on them, with the goal eventually that these emissions will be priced and obviously added on top of the price of the product, as also leveling the playing field in terms of competition between European companies in these energy-intensive sectors, but also non-European companies in these sectors. And of course, with global warming, to also have this goal of reducing CO2 emissions eventually globally, both for European companies and non-European companies. Maybe at this point, I will also share something else in the chat. There is actually a webinar coming up next week through a project that's funded by German Development Corporation on CBAM. It will be hybrid, so meaning it will be held in Brussels, but also accessible online. If you're interested in CBAM, to learn further about that, if you're coming to any of the from any of the sectors that I will also post in the chat, then I think your best bet would be at this point to make a note of this webinar and to join that next week, because that is, from my understanding, also including somebody from the European Union. I'm not sure who. I would have to look up the details, but I will put it in the chat, so maybe you can get some more answers there, and I hope that suffices for the time being. Are we having any further questions? We have about 5 minutes left in this session. I don't see that at the moment, but I think the chat will actually be closed after you leave the session. So if you're interested in CBAM, just stay online until I have posted the information about that webinar next week on CBAM. If you want to participate, you can register on the link that I will share. And if we don't have any further questions, then thank you so much already to Eva for joining us this morning, and again sharing your insights and practical experiences about dealing with CSR and due diligence and ESG here on the continent. I have posted your contact details in the chat. Eva's presentation will be shared afterwards. And with that, to anybody who's not interested anymore in CBAM, I wish you a good afternoon, maybe a last goodbye from you, Eva, and I think then it is a good day to everybody.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And if there is any questions afterwards from anybody, obviously now everybody has my contact details, but yeah, I shall leave it to you now and CBAM.
Okay, thank you so much. Then again, please stay on if you still want to have some information about CBAM. I will quickly look that up and post it in the chat. And to everybody else, thank you for joining us this morning, and have a good day and good afternoon.